February 1944, Northern Italy, during a winter campaign where small buildings could decide who lived and who didn't. This section covers the exact moment an American soldier was captured inside a stone farmhouse, disarmed by German infantry, and left with the one weapon they never thought to check. At the edge of a frozen field, a farmhouse stood alone, its stone walls darkened by old smoke stains and chipped by shell fragments that had missed their mark weeks earlier. Snow around the building was packed hard by boots, scuffed where men had slipped, dragged equipment, or gone down under fire, and the cold air carried the sharp mix of damp stone, sweat, and burned powder. Inside that farmhouse, an American soldier stood with his back to the wall, arms raised high enough to be seen by everyone in the room. His rifle was already gone, stripped from him seconds earlier, and now in German hands, turned over and checked with the casual confidence of men who believed the danger had passed. One German infantryman worked quickly through the search, hands patting pockets, tugging at webbing, pulling loose ammunition and a knife before tossing them aside without ceremony. The entire search took less than 10 seconds, which told you everything about how secure they thought the situation was. The American didn't resist, didn't speak, and didn't meet their eyes, keeping his gaze fixed on the cracked stone floor between his boots, while his breathing stayed slow and even. Panic would have drawn attention, and attention was the one thing he couldn't afford. A laugh broke the tension, followed by a comment in German that sounded more bored than alert, and that shift mattered. The tone in the room changed once his rifle was gone, shoulders relaxed, voices dropped, and weapons stopped tracking him quite so closely. Outside, more German soldiers arrived, their boots crunching in the snow as doors opened and shut. Orders passed down hallways, and the farmhouse transitioned from a fighting position into what they assumed was a secured capture site. From their perspective, the dangerous part was finished. What none of them noticed was the weight still pressed flat against the American's ribs, hidden beneath his jacket and webbing where hurried hands never lingered. 2 grenades sat there, cold metal against skin, familiar in shape and balance, missed because nobody believed they needed to look that closely. They had taken his rifle, taken his ammunition, and taken his knife, and that felt like enough. The grenades stayed exactly where they were. A German stepped closer and gestured toward the doorway with the barrel of his weapon, signaling it was time to move the prisoner outside. The American gave a single nod and shifted his weight, slow enough to look cooperative, careful enough not to draw notice. For a moment, the room settled into a quiet that felt almost routine, broken only by the wind outside and the muffled sounds of movement in other parts of the building. Floorboards creaked overhead, someone coughed, and no one was watching him closely anymore. 3 Germans stood within arm's reach, another pair near the door, more than enough to handle an unarmed prisoner who appeared to be finished. None of them were thinking about what could still go wrong. The American lowered his hands gradually, not fast enough to alarm anyone, letting cloth shift and webbing tighten as his arms moved. A faint scrape of metal against fabric cut through the room, small enough to be missed if you weren't listening for it. One German frowned, another started to speak, and that hesitation cost them everything. His hands closed around steel, the pin came free, and the shout that followed arrived just as the first grenade detonated at chest height. The explosion ripped through the room, hammering bodies with pressure and fragments, throwing men into walls, furniture, and each other as stone dust and splinters filled the air. For an instant, sight and sound vanished into smoke and concussion, and then the screaming began. When the haze thinned enough to see, order was gone. German soldiers lay on the floor in broken positions, some motionless, others clutching at wounds they didn't yet understand, while blood spread dark across stone now coated in pale dust. The American was no longer where he had been standing. Before anyone could recover, the second grenade detonated, finishing what the first had started, and turning the farmhouse into a killing space where control no longer existed. Another wave of heat and pressure tore through the room, collapsing whatever confidence the Germans had carried inside with them. Men stumbled blindly through smoke, weapons clattered to the floor, and shouted orders overlapped without meaning, as those still on their feet tried to understand how a prisoner had become the most dangerous man in the building. Outside, German soldiers heard the blasts and rushed toward the farmhouse, rifles up and voices raised, only to be met by smoke pouring from windows and the sound of chaos where there should have been order. Nobody knew who was alive inside, who was dead, or where the American had gone. Inside the room, he was already moving, using confusion and smoke the way others used cover, and what followed unfolded in less than a minute. When it was over, the farmhouse fell silent again, broken only by wind through shattered glass and the low sounds of men who would never fight again. The soldiers who had walked in expecting a compliant prisoner were dead, wounded, or running blindly into the snow, desperate to get away from a building that had turned on them without warning. They never expected it, never thought they needed to, because they had taken his rifle and convinced themselves the danger was gone. They forgot the grenades. February 1944 in Italy was not a clean campaign. And this explains why the Americans standing in that farmhouse had already decided that surrender did not guarantee survival. What shaped that decision was not bravado or impulse, but months of fighting where captivity often meant something far worse than losing a weapon. Long before he was pushed against that wall, the war had taught him how quickly rules collapsed once fighting moved into mountains, villages, and snow-choked roads. Italy was a place where front lines blurred every night, where a position held in the morning could be abandoned by afternoon, and where small patrols disappeared without leaving much behind except unanswered questions. Experience changed how soldiers evaluated risk. Early in a campaign, surrender still carried the expectation of procedure, paperwork, and transport to the rear. But Italy stripped that expectation away piece by piece. Prisoners were taken, yes, but others were beaten, ignored, or shot when circumstances shifted, and nobody felt like dealing with captives anymore. Stories moved faster than orders. They spread in low voices during halts, while cleaning weapons, or while sharing cigarettes in doorways that barely offered shelter. Certain roads were dangerous, certain enemy units unpredictable, and certain moments especially unforgiving if you were caught alone. The American had listened to those stories because everyone did, and the longer he fought, the less exaggerated they sounded. Too many men had vanished after being taken, and too many bodies turned up in places where no firefight had been reported. Italy forced soldiers to accept something uncomfortable. Control was temporary, and mercy depended on conditions that could change in seconds. By the winter of 1943 into 1944, Allied advances were grinding northward, but nothing about it felt like momentum. Progress came in yards, not miles, and each yard demanded effort that drained men physically and mentally. Rain-soaked uniforms for days, cold worked into joints, and exhaustion blurred judgment when it mattered most. Capture stopped being an abstract possibility and became a constant risk attached to every patrol and every movement through open ground. Men were taken not because they panicked, but because chaos closed around them faster than anyone could react. The American absorbed those lessons quietly. He didn't talk about them, didn't announce decisions, and didn't frame them as principles. Instead, he adjusted his behavior, checked his equipment more often, memorized where every piece of gear sat on his body, and trained his hands to move without hesitation. And that's where the decision took shape. Somewhere along the way, he decided that if he was captured and the situation felt unstable, if guards were rushed, distracted, or too relaxed, he would not wait to see what came next. Waiting gave control back to the enemy, and control was rarely returned once it was lost. That decision wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't heroic. It was practical, born from watching how quickly circumstances turned ugly once confusion entered the picture. Standing in the farmhouse, he recognized those warning signs immediately. The search had been fast, almost careless, and the mood in the room shifted the moment his rifle was removed. Voices softened, posture loosened, and attention drifted away from him toward other tasks. That shift mattered more than numbers. Experienced soldiers stayed tense when they believed danger still existed, but relaxed when they thought control had been restored. The Germans believed the threat was over, which meant they had stopped watching him closely. He felt the grenades still pressed against his ribs and understood what that meant without needing to think it through. This was not a stable capture, not a carefully managed transfer of prisoners, and not a moment where patience improved his chances. This was a gap. Moments like that didn't last long. Either discipline snapped back into place, or everything fell apart. Once reinforcements arrived, once someone took responsibility for him specifically, the chance to act would disappear. The American didn't know exactly what would happen if he complied and walked outside, but he knew the window he was standing in was already closing. Compliance would buy time for the Germans, not for him. So instead of feeling relief when the search ended, he felt urgency. The fact that they had missed the grenades wasn't luck. It was a warning that the situation was unfinished. That was why his hands didn't shake when he moved, and why his breathing stayed steady when the moment came. The decision had already been made earlier, shaped by months of fighting, where surrender sometimes meant dying a few minutes later in a place no one would ever mark on a map. In that farmhouse, surrender wasn't an ending. It was a pause, and pauses in Italy had a way of killing men who waited too long. That understanding, more than courage or anger, was what pushed him to act when everyone else assumed the danger had passed. The farmhouse was never supposed to matter. It wasn't listed as an objective, it wasn't circled on a map, and nobody had planned to fight over it when the day began. It was just another stone building sitting too close to a road that both sides needed, and that alone made it dangerous. By February 1944, northern Italy had settled into a rhythm that felt punishingly slow. Advances happened in short bursts, followed by long pauses filled with patrols, probing attacks, and constant pressure meant to keep the enemy off balance. Nothing stayed quiet for long, and nothing stayed safe just because it had been safe yesterday. That morning's task was routine by infantry standards. Push forward, test the next line of resistance, and clear any position that could threaten movement along the road. No speeches, no sense that this patrol would be different from the dozens that came before it. The terrain changed that quickly. Snow fell heavier than expected, thick enough to soften sound and erase distance, but not enough to hide movement completely. Visibility dropped to a few dozen yards, and spacing between men collapsed as they instinctively stayed close enough to keep track of one another through the white haze. Somewhere ahead, German infantry were moving through the same conditions, just as cautious and just as tired. The farmhouse appeared suddenly through the snow, darker than the field around it, solid and intact, where so much else had been reduced to rubble. Its position mattered immediately. Too close to the road to ignore, too well built to assume it was empty. Empty buildings were rarely empty by accident. The patrol slowed, weapons raised, eyes scanning windows and doorways, while snow drifted sideways across their vision. The American moved forward to get a clearer angle, stepping just far enough to see around the corner. That was when the firing began. It wasn't wild or panicked. The shots were controlled, aimed, and close. Rounds snapped into stone, fragments kicked off the wall, and the sound echoed strangely in the open field, making it hard to judge distance or direction. The Germans had been waiting. The American reacted immediately, diving for cover and returning fire toward flashes that appeared and vanished almost as quickly as they came. For several seconds, the fight was real and evenly matched, with shouted warnings, short bursts of gunfire, and men scrambling for better positions. Then the balance shifted. The farmhouse wasn't held by a single squad. More Germans were positioned behind it, using the building as cover and funneling fire into the patrol's exposed flank. What had looked like a simple probe turned into a shallow pocket with no clean way out. Orders came fast and didn't agree with each other. Pull back. Hold where you are. Cover the withdrawal. In that terrain, those instructions blurred into noise. Snow swallowed movement. Gunfire masked voices, and visibility dropped far enough that men lost sight of each other in seconds. The American moved to reposition, trying to reconnect with his unit, but landmarks disappeared almost immediately. Shapes dissolved into shadows, shadows into nothing. And when the firing slowed, the patrol was no longer together. Some men had pulled back. Some had gone wide. Others were still firing from positions he couldn't see. He was alone. That wasn't unusual in Italy. Men were separated constantly, sometimes finding their units hours later, sometimes days, and sometimes not at all. The difference here was how close the Germans were. He stayed low, using the farmhouse wall for cover while trying to orient himself, knowing he couldn't remain there for long. The longer he stayed, the tighter the enemy cordon would become. That was when he saw them. A second group of German infantry moved around the far side of the building, advancing quickly, focused outward toward the retreating Americans. They hadn't spotted him yet, and for a moment, the possibility of slipping past them crossed his mind. The numbers ended that thought. There were too many, moving too fast. And all it would take was one man turning his head at the wrong moment. Running meant being hunted, and fighting meant dying where he stood. That left one option. He stepped out from cover and raised his hands. The reaction was immediate. Rifles swung toward him, voices rose, and boots crunched forward through the snow. Weapons were shoved close enough that he could smell oil and metal, close enough that any sudden movement would have ended everything. The capture happened fast and clean. They disarmed him with practiced efficiency, taking his rifle, stripping his ammunition, and keeping his hands visible while they moved him toward the farmhouse. Resistance at that moment would have accomplished nothing except shortening his life. Inside the building, the air was still thick with smoke from the earlier exchange. Debris littered the floor, and the sound of movement echoed through rooms that were being cleared in a hurry. More Germans filtered in, talking over each other, calling out positions, and shifting focus from the captured American to the larger task of securing the structure. The room grew crowded and loud, and that detail mattered immediately. Crowded spaces bred distraction. As the search began, he stayed cooperative, letting hands move over his gear and pockets, letting items be pulled free and tossed aside. When the knife was taken, he didn't react. When the ammunition was removed, he didn't look down. When the search ended, the grenades were still there. He knew it instantly without checking. The familiar pressure against his ribs hadn't changed, and the weight was still balanced exactly where it always sat. That was the moment he understood the capture wasn't finished. The Germans were still transitioning, still flowing from one task to the next, without stopping to reset discipline. No one had taken responsibility for watching him specifically, and attention drifted toward doorways, hallways, and the sounds of movement outside. That was how he ended up standing against the wall, unbound, unguarded, and still armed in the one way that mattered. Not because he had been careless, but because war created moments where every option was bad, and survival depended on choosing the one that kept a door open just a little longer. In that farmhouse, the door hadn't closed yet. The grenades being missed weren't the real mistake. That was just the detail that made everything else visible. The real failure happened the moment the Germans decided the situation was finished. Combat has a dangerous in-between phase. A short stretch after shooting stops, but before control is fully re-established. Weapons dip slightly. Voices change. Movements lose urgency. Soldiers stop reacting and start assuming. That window doesn't last long, but when it appears, it kills people. Inside the farmhouse, the Germans slipped straight into it. From their point of view, the hard part was over. The American had been isolated, disarmed, and pushed inside. His rifle was gone. His ammunition was gone. He wasn't resisting, wasn't arguing, and wasn't trying to run. Everything about his posture said compliance. That impression shaped their behavior immediately. Nobody forced him to kneel. Nobody bound his hands. Nobody positioned a guard whose only job was to watch him. Instead, he became background. One soldier moved off to help clear another room. Another turned his back to shout orders down the hallway. A rifle was leaned against a wall. Someone adjusted a sling and relaxed their grip. The American noticed every one of those details. What mattered wasn't cruelty or arrogance, it was diffusion of responsibility. No single German believed the prisoner was his problem anymore, and once that happened, attention fractured into pieces too small to stop anything decisive. That's when the grenades stopped being hidden gear and became opportunity. They hadn't been missed because the Germans were incompetent. They were missed because nobody believed they still mattered. Once the rifle was gone, the search shifted from thorough to procedural, and procedural searches miss things when time feels more important than caution. The body language told the story. Voices softened. Postures opened. Eyes stopped tracking him. They believed control had returned. That belief was fatal. The American didn't rush the moment. He waited until the mistake fully matured, until the German's focus moved far enough away that nothing he did would be interpreted as resistance until it was already too late. When his hands lowered, the movement looked normal. When his webbing shifted, it sounded ordinary. Everything about his compliance fit their expectations right up to the instant it didn't. By the time one of them realized something was wrong, reaction time had already collapsed. Surprise doesn't just slow response, it breaks coordination. And coordination is the only thing that makes numbers matter. In that room, numbers stopped meaning anything. Position mattered. Timing mattered. And momentum mattered more than both. The grenades weren't luck, and they weren't desperation. They were tools used at the exact moment when the enemy believed violence had ended and order had returned. Once that illusion shattered, there was no resetting it. Command dissolved. Orders overlapped. Training fought panic and lost. The mistake didn't kill them all by itself, but it opened the door wide enough for everything that followed to happen. By the time the smoke filled the room, the decision had already been made for them. They just hadn't realized it yet. The first explosion didn't end the fight, and that misunderstanding cost lives almost immediately. Smoke and dust filled the room, pressure slammed bodies into stone, and for a brief instant, nobody knew which way was up or who was still standing. The American didn't wait for the room to make sense again, because waiting would have given the Germans time to recover. While men were still stunned and coughing, he moved through the haze, low and fast, stepping where he remembered bodies and weapons had been moments earlier. A rifle lay near the wall, dropped by a soldier who hadn't gotten back up. The American seized it, brought it to his shoulder, and fired without hesitation, the shot cracking sharply through the chaos and cutting down the first man who tried to move. Another German staggered into view, half-blinded, trying to bring his weapon up while shouting for orders that never came. The American fired again, then shifted position before anyone could fix on where the shots were coming from. Nothing about the movement was frantic. Every step had purpose. He stayed close to the walls, used the smoke as cover, and avoided standing still long enough to be targeted. A German lunged from the doorway, close enough that the American could see panic in his eyes. 2 shots ended it, and the body hit the floor before the man behind him even understood what had happened. Outside, boots pounded toward the entrance as reinforcements rushed forward, reacting to the blasts instead of coordinating. Someone shouted about grenades, another voice yelled for a machine gun, and none of it formed a plan. The American reached the doorway first. He fired through it, forcing the men outside to dive for cover instead of surging inside together, and that pause mattered more than numbers. Space opened up, seconds stretched, and those seconds kept the room from filling with fresh enemies. Inside, the smoke hung thick and burned the lungs. Furniture lay shattered, weapons scattered across the floor, and wounded men cried out without anyone answering them. The American reloaded by feel alone. Magazine seated and bolt worked in a motion practiced until it no longer required thought. Training took over where conscious decision would have slowed him down. Another German appeared at the far end of the room, rifle halfway up, disbelief frozen on his face. The American fired, and the disbelief ended with him. Some men tried to crawl toward the door, others froze where they were, and a few attempted to raise weapons they no longer had the coordination to use. The American didn't chase movement blindly. He watched, judged, and fired only when someone became a threat again. That distinction ended the fight faster than rage ever could. Men who tried to fight were cut down. Men who stopped moving stayed alive. Outside, the Germans hesitated, hearing gunfire but unable to see what was happening through the smoke pouring from the windows. Nobody wanted to be the next man through a doorway that had already swallowed too many. Inside, the American held the center of the room, rifle steady, breath controlled, tracking doorways and corners while the violence burned itself out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it ended. No more shots. No more shouting. Only the wind outside and the soft, settling sounds of a building damaged but still standing. 60 seconds had been enough. A capture had turned into a rout, and control had collapsed so completely that the Germans, still able to move, chose distance over dominance. They backed away, then ran, leaving the farmhouse behind along with anyone who couldn't follow. The American didn't pursue them into the snow. He didn't need to. The room belonged to him now. Silence arrived without warning, the kind that feels heavier than noise because it confirms that nothing else is coming. One moment, the farmhouse had been filled with explosions, gunfire, and voices colliding over each other, and the next, there was only wind moving through broken windows and the faint creak of stone settling under stress. The American stayed where he was, rifle still up, breathing controlled, eyes moving. Experience had taught him that endings were often false, and men who relaxed too early rarely lived long enough to regret it. He waited, counting seconds, listening for boots, voices, or the scrape of metal that would signal another push. Nothing followed. No footsteps outside the door. No shouted orders. No return fire. Only then did he lower the rifle slightly and begin to take in the room. The floor was almost unrecognizable beneath dust, debris, and blood. Furniture lay smashed against walls, weapons scattered where they had been dropped in panic, and bodies rested in positions that told the story without explanation. Some of the Germans were dead where they had fallen. Others were wounded badly enough that moving was no longer an option. A few were still alive and staring at him. Shock sat behind their eyes more than pain, the look of men trying to understand how a routine capture had turned into something they would never forget. They had walked into that farmhouse expecting control, procedure, and compliance. They had found something else entirely. Keeping the rifle trained outward, the American backed toward the doorway and stepped into the cold air outside. Snow cut against his face, sharp and clean after the smoke-filled room, and gray light filtered down onto a yard now marked by boot tracks and sudden abandonment. The Germans were gone, not regrouping nearby, not setting up a perimeter. Gone. They had withdrawn fast, leaving the building and their wounded behind, choosing distance over dominance once it became clear the situation inside had spiraled beyond control. Whatever confidence they had carried into that capture had vanished the moment the room exploded. The American didn't follow them. Chasing was never the goal. Staying alive was. Within minutes, friendly troops began moving back toward the farmhouse, drawn by the noise but cautious as they approached. Weapons came up, then lowered when they saw him standing there, alive, steady, and holding the ground alone. Questions followed immediately. Overlapping and urgent, but answers were brief. There wasn't time for explanations, and the war didn't pause for reflection. The wounded were secured, the building cleared properly this time, and guards were posted with attention that hadn't existed earlier. Weapons were gathered. Positions were reset. The unit reformed. By the end of the day, the farmhouse was just another location passed and left behind as the front shifted again. Maps changed. Orders changed. The war continued north. But moments like that didn't disappear. They traveled quietly, passed from one group of soldiers to another, retold in low voices without exaggeration, because exaggeration wasn't needed. A prisoner, a rushed search, a building that turned deadly in seconds. It became a reminder. That surrender didn't always mean safety. That control was fragile. That the space between fighting and order was where people died. The American kept fighting after that day, but the moment didn't change him into something reckless. If anything, it sharpened habits that were already there. He stayed cautious, deliberate, and alert to the smallest shifts in tone or behavior that signaled danger. What happened in that farmhouse wasn't treated as heroism by the man who lived it. There were no speeches, no celebration, and no sense that something extraordinary had occurred. From his perspective, it had simply been the correct response to a situation that offered no good options. Surrender, in that room, hadn't been an ending. It had been a pause. And pauses, especially in Italy, had a way of killing men who waited too long to act. So he didn't wait. He moved. And 60 seconds later, he was still alive in a war that rarely gave second chances. If you want more stories like this, moments where a single decision flipped everything, make sure you're subscribed.